When it comes to high-performance engines, there are very few which are as intriguing as the V10, and also, interestingly enough, very few engine types which are as versatile as a V10 can be. You can have huge capacity torquey monsters, or super low capacity high revving screamers, and even diesel versions as well, as we're going to get into in this list. But the purpose of this list is not just to talk about cool V10 engine cars like Carrera GTs and Lexus LFAs. You already know about that. This is about the dozen or so V10 engine cars that you can actually buy on a budget. Now, some of these are going to be more expensive, but not a single vehicle on this list will set you back six figures. Some of them won't even set you back five figures. Yes, less than 10 grand for a V10 is doable, and stick with me to find out which ones those are. And in order to keep things fresh and keep you guessing, the list isn't really going to be in any particular order, so be sure to stick around for the whole thing. You might just pick up some nuggets that you weren't aware of. Now, kicking us off is a very well-known choice, but it has to, of course, be on the list. The Audi RS6. It's an absolute monster of a car, but what many people overlook is it's actually also a pretty unique car, not just because it has a V10 in a wagon, which is cool, but because for Audi, and even in general, it is super rare to have a production-based turbo petrol V10. The vast majority are naturally aspirated, and those which aren't tend to be diesels. The fact that this one is a 5-litre twin-turbo V10 with 570 horsepower is pretty unique, especially for Audi, where they typically like to use a naturally aspirated 5.2 V10 in most of their applications. Combine that with the fact that it's been phased out by faster V8 versions since, which helps the price to come down, the fact it has all-wheel drive and tons of space, well, of course, it's a hugely viable option as a daily driver, and it's one of the best all-round ways to become part of the hashtag V10 life movement, if you will. Next up on the list, we're going to make it personal. And of course, the footage that you can see on screen is from my car review series here on the channel called Beards and Cars, so if you want to check out that review to hear more about the specific vehicle, of course you can do so, but I couldn't possibly make an affordable V10 list without talking about my own previous car. In fact, this was my first car, the Volkswagen Touareg V10 TDI. An absolute beast of a car, and in some ways still the best all-round car I've ever owned in terms of practicality and performance, and technically you can even count a couple of different versions of this car. You've got the V10 TDI, but you've then also got the R50, which has that same diesel V10 turned up to 11 with even more power and torque and more of a pure focus on performance. Now, the R50s will set you back more money, but in the case of mine, I paid about 5 grand for it, and that is a huge amount of car for the money, especially when it puts out more torque than a Nissan GTR, and in the case of mine with a remapped engine, consistently ran averages of 26 miles per gallon. And that was from fuel receipts, so it wasn't just me making up numbers. In terms of affordability, the Touareg V10 is arguably the best one on the list. There's one other car which shares its exact same engine, also from Volkswagen, which we'll talk about in a little bit, which you can sometimes find for a similar price, but overall the Touareg is pretty much the cheapest V10 option you can find, and in my opinion and my experience, contrary to many of the horror stories, also one of the best options. Next up though, we're keeping it in Germany to move to BMW, and of course it's another essential car to have on the list. The car which you could say revolutionised the super saloon scene in the later 2000s. Of course, I'm talking about the BMW M5, the E60 generation, one of 2 cars on the list to share this engine, of course the other being the M6, which we'll talk about later on. This one though has that extra layer of practicality. You can find this one, much like the Audi RS6, in either sedan or wagon form, although at least in the UK the wagons are really rare these days, but again, find one if you can. And in terms of performance, it's a beast. 5-litre naturally aspirated V10, 500 horsepower, not the torquiest thing around, more of kind of a supercar approach to a V10 engine, the kind that you would typically expect to find, in fact. And in terms of performance, well, without the limiter, this 7-speed monster, which is sometimes criticised for its gearbox, it has to be said, can do about 205 miles an hour. It's an absolute monster, and prices are shockingly good for the amount of car that you get for the money. Next up, we're jumping over to the States for perhaps the most obscure option of these 12. In fact, if you live outside North America, this one might have even not been on your radar at all, because Ford has a V10 that you can buy, and it's found in a couple of different vehicles, such as the F-250 and the Excursion. And it actually had a fairly long production run with over 750,000 vehicles built with these engines. Now, it's not the fastest thing around, but it was developed from the existing 5.4 litre V8 into a 6.8 litre V10. Now, originally you were looking at about 300 horsepower, 425 pound-feet, and toward the end of the run more like 360 horsepower and 460 pound-feet. Fuel economy is known to be fairly horrendous, unsurprisingly, but again, it's an option which those of us, especially in Europe and beyond, might not have ever heard of. But the fact is, it's a V10, and it's in a vehicle which certainly, much like the Touareg, has a ton of space and usability as a daily driver. It's quite possibly the slowest vehicle on the list as well, but still, a V10 is a V10. And keeping it on the subject of V10 engined heavy duty haulers, of course I couldn't miss the opportunity to mention probably the most badass production truck in the world, the Viper SRT10 engined Ram SRT10. The curious thing about the Ram SRT10 is it's available in two forms which are very different to each other. There's the single cab with 2 doors and a manual gearbox, and there's the quad cab or double cab. I'm not technical on those pickup terms, but the one with 4 doors, in other words, and that one curiously only came with an auto gearbox. So it very much is between what you want. You've got the 2-door manual sport truck and the 4-door auto, more daily driver approach. Of course, with the Viper engine, it's a beast. 8.3 litres, 500 horsepower, and famously Evo magazine took one around their test track, and it was as quick as a Clio V6, which for a over 2-ton rear-wheel drive pickup truck is pretty insane. You know what's also insane? It's fuel economy. Jumping back over to Germany though, we have one of my personal favourites on this list, and a vehicle which I really hope to review in future, because I think it's a sleeper hit in the making. It's another Audi and another V10 of course, but this one is arguably the ultimate V10 in terms of status, the S8. This has the 5.2 litre V10 option without the turbochargers and a more modest 450 horsepower and about 400 pound-feet of torque. But the performance is fantastic, and crucially, at least currently here in the UK, you can buy one of these V10 beasts of a limo for 10 grand. Now, it is a calculated risk. If something breaks, it's gonna cost a lot, but I would say this is potentially a very significant car for you to consider if you're the kind of person who loves the idea of, for instance, a Bentley Continental GT, but is scared of some of those costs and maybe just wants to save about 5 or 6 grand on the purchase price as well. This essentially offers most of what the Bentley can do. It's more of a sleeper, and it's a V10 engine limo. What's not to like? To jump back to BMW once again, of course we have to talk about the M6. Now, I've heard from some owners of the M6 in my reviews of other 6 Series models that at lower speeds you can't really tell that it has a V10 engine. It actually sounds kind of similar to the diesel versions, but of course most people who buy something like an M5 or an M6 plan to push it pretty hard. There's a guy local to me who owns an M6 and it still looks fantastic. Personally, I love it in that kind of burnt red that they did, and much like the M5, the performance is of course fantastic. My choice would probably be the M6, to be honest, over the M5, but again, it depends on what you need. It's kind of like the comparison that I did on the channel between the Jag XKR and the XFR. Super sports car or super saloon? It depends on your circumstances, but either way, just like the M5, it's shockingly cheap for how much car you get. Once again though, we are sticking in that German rut, because to move on from the Touareg V10, we of course have to talk about the car which I almost bought as my first car, but ultimately went for the extra space of the Touareg, and I'm glad I did. The very interesting and intriguing Phaeton. The Bentley shared platform with, funnily enough, the Flying Spur and the Continental, but with more of a kind of Passat kind of look to it, where it's super understated but still kind of handsome in its own way in my opinion. And it has of course the monstrous 6-litre W12 option, although many people don't know the Touareg had that as well in a limited edition form, but you can get it with that same 310 horsepower, 550 pound-feet of torque, diesel V10 that the Touareg has. It's quicker than the Touareg as well because it weighs about 300 kilos less and has, let's just say, a smaller aerodynamic punch that it needs to make. In terms of luxury, it's designed to be more of a limo, of course, so again, it really depends on what you want from your car. I was super tempted to get a Phaeton, but ultimately I'm glad I went for the Touareg for the extra space, of course the height, the feel, it's just more my thing, but I'd still love to get my hands on one of those Phaetons. Now we move into easily the single most exotic car on the list, but once again, at least here in the UK, a car which you might be surprised why it could even be on the list at all. Because it's not a six-figure car anymore. The Lamborghini Gallardo, in particular the first generation, the 5-litre, 500 horsepower V10, some people would even argue it's still the best looking version of the Gallardo, and yeah, it certainly still has a ton of presence and fantastic performance of course. You can buy one in the UK for what, about 60-70 grand currently, and I could see these going up in future. The Murcielago already did. The Gallardo isn't quite that level of iconic, but I could certainly see the price going up in future, so much like something such as a Bentley Conti GT or a Jag XKR, now is probably the time to get one if you're going to. And to keep it in the family, especially the exotic family again, we're going to jump back to Audi. And of course, I reviewed this one recently on the channel, a facelifted version of the Audi R8 V10, the Spider version in particular, but you've got options there. You've got the older one, which is even cheaper, the pre-facelift, and it's a very subtle facelift. But it's even more powerful than the Gallardo of the older generation, it's faster, of course it's slightly better value in terms of how much car you get for the money because of the Audi badge compared to the Lamborghini badge, and it wouldn't surprise me at all if some of the parts are probably cheaper as well if something does go wrong, once again because of the difference in badges, kind of like the Phaeton versus Bentley argument. Now though, we need to jump back to Audi once again to the car which isn't my favourite of their V10s, but I believe might actually be the best, because this one is the one that everyone overlooks, and that is simultaneously its biggest weakness and its biggest strength. The S6. Not the RS6, this one has the naturally aspirated engine, not the 5-litre twin-turbo but the 5.2 V10, which it shares with the S8, albeit slightly less powerful in this form with 435 horsepower. Just like the RS6, you can get it as a sedan or a wagon, and I think it's a genius car, because even though this is technically slower than the RS6 and certainly not as good looking, it's still got a V10 engine, it's a total sleeper, and the fact that it's completely overshadowed by the RS means that it's a dirt cheap bargain with almost all of that car's raw ability. And of course, to round out our list of cars which you can buy with V10 engines for under 100 grand, in the case of this one, it'll depend on the spec you choose, but if you choose for instance an older one, even a mid-life version, and some of the newer ones as long as you stay away from the ACR, well now I've said that, of course you know what I'm talking about, the Dodge Viper. We already talked about the Ram SRT10, you can't not talk about the Viper, because much like the Gallardo or the R8, it's the more overt high-performance option. Totally different approach to the R8 or the Lambo though, with the front engine, more muscle car vibe to it. And again, those older ones you can pick up even here in the UK for like 35, 45 grand, and an SRT10 a little bit more, what, 50 to 70 depending on where you buy it from. Again, massive amount of car for the money. In terms of sheer performance, it can certainly give an R8 or a Gallardo a run for their money, and if I had to choose one, I think I'd actually go Viper personally. For me, the only drawback is it only comes in a manual, and I'm not a fan of that personally, but apart from that, it's a beast of a car. Of course, it's one of the most famous on the list, but it's famous for a reason, and the fact that it's on the list at all tells you a lot about how much more affordable it is than you might think. So tell me down below, which is your favourite V10 option on the list? Which one had you maybe never heard of? Perhaps that Ford V10, which is probably the most obscure here for non-Americans. For me, I've got a number of cars here which I love, a couple of them I've already driven, a couple I really want to review in future, and who knows, a couple of them I may love enough to even buy. Who knows, we'll have to wait and see. But ultimately that's it for this list. Of course, check out Beards and Cars here on the channel, and even here on screen in its playlist, to see the cars that I've already done road test reviews for, and stick around on the channel for more vids like this in future. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.